Welcome to Polaris-Live, conversations on the US-China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This user-supported channel is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Viewers may ask questions using the bar on the right-hand side of the screen. The upcoming United States presidential elections are being called the most important signal for the future direction of U.S. domestic and foreign policy in generations. Throughout this autumn, we will invite a select group of international experts to offer their views on the American elections and how countries around the world, especially China, are preparing for their outcome. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, and my guest today is Mr. Cameron Johnson. Mr. Johnson has over 20 years of management experience across various industries in China and has lived and done business in Beijing, Shanghai, Changchun, and Chongqing. He's currently a senior partner at TidalWave, a boutique consulting firm based in Shanghai. He's also an adjunct faculty member at New York University Shanghai and an advisor to the National IDC Industrial Technological Innovation Strategic Alliance. This is a China-based technology association, and he's an active member of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. Welcome to Polaris-Live, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Sarwar, for having me. It's great to be here.
Nikkei Asia, the well-known Japanese business publication, reports, Cameron, that China saw the world's biggest outflow of high net worth individuals last year and is expected to see a record exodus of over 15,000 in 2024. In the United States, China's arch rival is their top destination. What's happening here?
I think what you're seeing, and there's been a lot of people movement for over a generation. So I think part of what you're seeing is kind of a lack of confidence to some degree, maybe a bit of a bet with the family or business that there might, at this time anyway, be other locations that might be more suitable. I think also part of the issue is there's a lack of roadmap for where things go from here in China. So, for example, the last 25 years, we had a fantastic roadmap. It was infrastructure at roads and ports, then real estate, retail, Starbucks, Disney, those kinds of things. So business and people, we generally knew which directions to go and where we could be effective, where we could make money generally. But now that's a little bit unclear. And some of this uncertainty has brought with it the fact that people are now looking at other options.
Well, when we think of the Chinese Communist Party, one thing that comes to mind is control. And to a lot of people, including myself, the idea that people can just pick up and leave China and take their money is a little bit out of, if you will, scenario. So is that really how it is, that the people in China can just pick up, take their money and leave?
To some degree, there are restrictions. For example, you can't send unlimited amounts of money out of the country. Oftentimes, as a person or business, if you pay taxes on the money, you can. So, for example, most citizens in country are allowed $50,000 worth per year. If you pay money or if you pay taxes on the money you make, sometimes that's more. So there are restrictions, but it is possible to get some cash out of the country, particularly depending on what you're doing. Maybe not as much as people, for example, do in Europe or the States, but it is possible to do some of that, yes.
But how does that work for people who are in important positions? For example, a chip engineer. Without their restrictions there that apply?
Not as far as I know. Talent is a bit of a free flow.
Right.
It's different between assets. Right, assets are more challenging than it is for free flow of talent. So if you're an engineer and you're working at a company, you can go between, China and Japan, perhaps. or other locations. We see lots of engineers, for example, from Southeast Asia starting to come into China or into Japan and South Korea to fuel some of those industries. So the movement of talent is something that's just happening overall. But to your point, it is more the assets that are more restricted.
Okay. So not long ago, China was referred to as the mother of all investment opportunities. This is no longer valid?
I think it depends on the industry. For example, we've seen massive investment in chemicals, automotive, healthcare. Those are pretty obvious. So in terms of investment, you're still seeing investment go into those industries. On the industries that are no longer attractive, real estate is the number one obvious one. Retail to some degree. For example, we see coffee chains such as a Starbucks or Peet's. They're slowing down a bit of their investment. A lot of that has to do with domestic competition, combined with the slowing economy. So there are opportunities for investments. I've actually argued to some of our clients that, depending on the industry, this could be the best time to invest in a generation, because you have ample desire by the government to get investment. And with that, you can potentially get certain benefits from that. Talent is cheaper now because there are a lot of available talent out in the world or out in the market, whether they're young, they're mid-level or senior level. So there's a lot of opportunity if you're in the right industries and you have the right game plan.
President Xi Jinping, you're talking about the Chinese economy slowing down a bit. President Xi Jinping has always been averse to pumping large amounts of money into China's economy. But just today, China unleashed a swathe of stimulus measures, including cuts to its benchmark rate, funding to boost the stock market and aid share buybacks, as well as more support for the stricken property sector. Why now, Cameron? Has something changed in the last few hours?
There is a bit of a roadmap. I think part of what we saw after the third plenum is the government signaled that China is not in a crisis, it's in transition, right? There is challenges with debt. There are other challenges in the economy that they're slowly trying to deal with. I think some of what you're seeing is, particularly with today, we don't know the full ramifications or everything that's happening, but they are trying to stimulate certain parts of the economy, particularly on the financial side, and maybe with some of the investment to kind of stimulate more, not just the supply side, which has been more the historical model, but also a bit of the demand, particularly in the financial sector. I think what we're going to see more things like this. Some of it is there. I think we have to keep in mind that this has not happened, a slowing economy in China, for over a generation. So a lot of the tools have not been built up in the economy or in the apparatus to actually deal with this. In the United States, we've had 4 or 5 economic slowdowns or recessions, in the last 30 years or so. So China hasn't had this, so they're now building some of this out. So some of this is throwing things against the wall to see what happens. The rest, though, they are putting together a roadmap and a plan to actually deal with more of the biggest challenges, such as the real estate sector.
But the economy in China, if I have my numbers correct, still is growing at around 5% a year, right? That's their rate that they've set. So I mean, this is a little better than what the economy is doing here. So the economy is not really in trouble, right? There's no panic around. It's, as you say, slower than it has grown over the last 2 decades. So am I right about that it's not a panic situation, or are we seeing something now that's more drastic?
I think what we're seeing is that they're attempting to figure out how to put a roadmap in place for more economic sustainable growth. So this is why we see they're not focused on debt issuance, for example, with real estate or infrastructure, those kind of projects. We're seeing more focused on manufacturing is obvious. They are trying to boost that, but they're also trying to do other things, such as I think in Shanghai, for example, and in other big cities, they're talking about doing more medical insurance or medical benefits to help the populace with some of those costs. And that's a way to stimulate more internal demand because people will have to worry less about if I get sick, then I have to go spend a bunch of money, on medical bills. So, and I think to your point as well, yes, the challenge is 5% hasn't been done for many years. And so what does it actually look like? When they were growing 8% a year, if you were a graduate, college graduate, if you're mid-level, you had job opportunities. You could switch your job if you wanted to make more money. But a lot of that roadmap has now evaporated. And so we don't kind of know what the next phase is. And so some of it is what you're seeing is kind of this recalibration in the economy. What does a 5% Chinese economy look like without real estate involved in it? We just don't know the answer to that yet.
Right. And it might be a good time to remind our viewers that in China, the government sets a growth rate and then meets it, as opposed to in America and Europe, where we actually count what's being produced as a GDP. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think the last couple of years it's been more targeted growth instead of exact. So, the target is 5%.
Right.
As an example. So versus it's a hard 5%, we have to hit it no matter what. So, and I think what you'll see now that they put in some of these policies, as you mentioned today, I think they'll probably get very close to the 5% this year.
So I'm going to switch now to this phrase that seems to have crept into headlines over the last few months, which is China's overcapacity, right? It's in headlines all over the Europe and in America. And I guess it means China cannot consume everything it makes. It has a huge industrial sector. So China dumps its goods in other countries at unfairly low prices. Am I right? That's what overcapacity is. And if so, why the concern? Because low prices, it seems to me, are helpful to especially the hardworking Americans who are trying to stretch every dollar.
No, you're right. That is generally what overcapacity means. I think in this case, the overcapacity is very much in the eye of the beholder. If you're Australia, if you're Southeast Asia, if you're Middle East or Mexico, you love Chinese overcapacity. You love it because items are cheap. You have access to plentiful choices, and it's a constant stream of business. I think that when you look at the EU and the US, you really don't like what's happening. And part of that is because the US and Europe particularly make very similar products. For example, automotive is kind of the most obvious one that people have the problem with. But it doesn't necessarily mean cheaper goods, though. It does mean more choice, though. The other thing that overcapacity in China means is with the raw materials and the intermediate materials, but essentially parts or processed materials. And this is one of the issues, particularly that the US and Europe have over this is, for example, if you have solar panels and ingots and these kinds of things, China has overcapacity in that area at almost all levels. And so if you're a US solar panel firm and you're trying to make solar panels, it gets more and more difficult to do that because you have cheap, not just solar panels, but also all of these levels of inputs that can go into your business or that can compete with your business, and you won't be able to make as much money. Europe is a little bit different. They're more looking at it as we don't want to lose our own domestic industry, particularly with automotive. Automotive is the most sensitive one. The US has a little bit of that, but it is slightly different because of the North American integration on trade with the USMCA. But Europe is really the bellwether for how to deal with Chinese capacity, but also the technology advantage in EVs.
Do you think geopolitical tensions, especially the security aspect, has a significant amount to do with all this? Because I'm thinking now, the last few days, most of the cranes that unload and load cargo, big container boats and so on, come from China because America, we don't make them. And all of a sudden now, there's talk about cellular transmitters that have been put in these things, which can track goods coming in and out of America. Do you think that plays a part in all this? Are we getting carried away?
I think yes and no. Yes, we're definitely getting carried away with kind of the paranoia of anything, including my iPhone, can now be a device where the Chinese can spy on us. I just don't think that's the case. There are certain things we just simply can't produce. We cannot produce mobile phones at scale cheaply. It's just, as you mentioned with cranes. I've been in some of these discussions on the cranes, and the production of the cranes themselves is actually, as you said, not only do we not make them, but it'd be incredibly expensive to make them, and China makes the best in the world. And if we get them, and this is part of my discussion, why don't we just rip out the guts of the electronics and replace it? It's just, why are we going around and dancing around? It's just, frankly, I become more and more surprised at just the lack of understanding of how these things actually work. There is a security aspect, that's absolutely true. And I think both sides are playing that up, partly because there's a huge mistrust between both countries. And particularly the lack of transparency that some feel that Chinese firms don't give, and that they're all beholden supposedly to the whims of the party. And I don't agree with that necessarily. I think part of it also is that because we don't make this stuff here, we don't have any options. And so if we don't have any options, what happens if China someday wakes up and says, we don't want to give it to you anymore? And I think, again, this is part of the reason behind things like the CHIPS Act and others. There are security aspects, of course, but it's also, we want to make it so nobody else can tell us what to do or not give it to us. And oddly enough, this is exactly also what the Chinese side says. We need to develop this domestically and internally, so the foreigners can't dictate to us and control us and constrain us. And so both sides are kind of doing this to each other. And unfortunately, with that, it's feeding this narrative that if you're in the U.S., that China's coming for you, they're going to take over everything, they're a threat to you. And on the China side, that the U.S. goal and aim is to constrain you and control you so you can't become what you can ultimately be. Right. And so it's actually this narrative is feeding and playing off each other on both sides.
So let me take a moment to remind our viewers that Polaris-Live is entirely viewer supported. We'd appreciate you signing up to our mailing list at kashmeri.com, that's KASHMERI.com, and to our YouTube channel, which is www.polarislive.com. There's no cost, and it really does help us. Now back to our guest. Another issue that often surfaces in America is that setting up a business in the People's Republic of China means, Cameron, that one has to have a member of the Communist Party on one's board, and one has to share proprietary intellectual property information. Now, you've done business in China for many years, and I believe the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai polls U.S. businesses in China on a regular basis. So is this general assumption true, somewhat true? Tell us.
Yeah, I can only speak from my own experience. As far as I know, I have not seen, for example, an American firm forced to take on a member to be part of the board. I've run several companies in China. This has never happened at all to us, in my experience. To your point about what American businesses are, and again, the American Chamber of Commerce most recent survey came out about 2 weeks ago. The top 3 challenges pulled by members is geopolitics, which essentially is the U.S.-China relationship, a slowing economy, and domestic competition. When you actually drill down into the numbers, the industries that are profitable, right, where companies are making money, is auto, technology, chemicals, healthcare, pharmaceuticals. Where there are challenges and companies are struggling are things like real estate, for obviously, education services, banking, logistics. And so you see a bit of a mixed bag overall. In the final analysis, it was about 66% of companies last year polled were profitable. And with that, the next question is, well, are companies going to diversify? Are they going to de-risk, quote unquote, from China? When you actually look at the numbers, some are about a third, if not slightly more. Where are they going? They're going to Southeast Asia. They're going to India. They're going to Mexico. But there's almost nobody who's going to the U.S., who's actually reshoring to the U.S. And if you remember, one of the reasons that the trade war was launched and that a lot of these export controls and so on were put in place, and tariffs was to reshore some of that. And what we're seeing is we're not seeing any kind of reshoring really back to the United States of these businesses.
Well, that's interesting to hear. I also was interested in the fact that one of the issues that seems predominant when Americans argue about setting businesses in China is this forced sharing of intellectual property. I mean, if I understand you correctly, has been way down in the polls that the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai runs, that it's not even in the top three. Did I hear you right on that?
Yeah, that's correct. IP ranks about number 12 out of 15 concerns.
Wow.
And when you actually look at how IP has evolved in China the last decade plus, it had incremental, couple percent, 5% improvement every year on year from about 2012, 2013 up until about maybe 2021. And that's a lot. So we probably saw an overall 50% improvement just in terms of that, if not a little bit more. It decreased slightly in the during the pandemic, but now it's back on the upswing. And as the latest survey showed, it's number 12 out of 15 in terms of challenges or priorities. And so, is it an issue to some degree? Sure, but there are many other big issues. And I think most companies have understood how to better protect IP, both locally and globally, against Chinese competition.
Another issue that often surfaces in America is that the root of China's vast industrial capacity is its saving-centric society. Chinese save about 45% of their income. U.S. now saves about 3%, long-term around 8%. So couldn't this Chinese investment, all the savings, be used to support America's reindustrialization efforts? I mean, in the 1980s, we had somewhat the same issues with Japan when all the cars were coming in, and the clash was largely avoided in the U.S. by Japan accepting Japan's investment heavily in the American auto industry. Couldn't we do the same thing with China? Is it just geopolitics that puts, or is China different on the American radar screen than Japan was?
China is different because it's seen as a geopolitical competitor in every sphere, everywhere in the world. So that's part of the challenge. The other is the lack of trust. Japan was an ally, so when they did come and invest, there was nobody interested in things or worried about things such as data security and so on and so forth. And I think, yes, it's absolutely true that the Chinese could come in and help revitalize so much of our industry. In fact, this is something I argue even here as I am in DC. I'm not naive to the fact that there are data and security concerns. Of course there are. But my response to that is, how is it that the Chinese have figured out how to do it, and yet we cannot? It doesn't make any sense to me. For example, when you look at EVs, whether it's battery technology, software technology, the Chinese are at least a decade ahead and sometimes 15 years ahead of anything that is in the West. This is categorically, absolutely 100% impossible for us to have competitive industries when that's the case. Anything we develop, they're going to be, again, 10, 15 years ahead of us. And so part of my discussion here, particularly this week, is how can we actually make this happen? So, for example, one of the scenarios that I discuss is we could buy the technology or license it in the case of like CATL or Goshen, which is trying to do with Ford and GM, and then we fork it, and then we make it indigenous, and then we don't have to spend $100 billion in 10 years developing our own domestic technology. It doesn't make any sense. It's already there. The response is, security, data, so on and so forth. But we can, again, if the Chinese have figured it out, why can't we? There is a way to do this and have a national security box that still provides for the American business community and ultimately the American worker, and building up the industries of the future. Otherwise, what is going to happen is I think we're seeing some of what's happening in Europe. As they continue to have challenges and as the business models and the products they make are not necessarily for today's world, meaning 2024, they're going to slowly but surely kind of decline. And this is a problem we don't want to have. And the solutions are actually before us. And so, yes, absolutely. I think within a national security framework, it can be done. But politically, I just think it's unpalatable at this time for it to actually be done.
You know, what you say just makes so much sense. Well, maybe we'll work towards it. So I'm going to now try to ask a question for which there may not be any answer at this point, but I will. Coming back to the US elections, Cameron, how is China strategizing for whatever the election results may bring, you think? One item I've heard in my trip to Washington a couple of weeks ago is that the Chinese are giving some serious thought to what we refer to as their wolf warrior, interaction with America, meaning hitting hard, and that maybe there's a way to soften that. What are you hearing? I mean, how are they strategizing? Can you shed any light on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. What we're seeing is a bit of a tone downing of the wolf warrior diplomacy. Um, we saw the recent release of David Lin about 2 weeks ago. It's clear that the Chinese are signaling to the U.S. That they want better relations. Um, but particularly when you discuss on the ground in China, China in some ways feels that whether it's a Harris or Trump administration, that it's really just two bowls of poison, is that either one isn't going to be very good for China. With the potential Harris administration, it's somewhat viewed as to be a similar direction as the current Biden administration approach, some stronger controls, maybe some tariff refinement, but the direction is very similar to what is currently ongoing. With Trump, it's just a bunch of uncertainty. There is an assumption that tariffs and other things will be levied to put maximum amount of pressure on China to potentially cut a deal, or just politically, that's the direction it goes. So the word uncertainty comes to mind. The other challenge is nobody quite knows who's actually going to be in the China teams of either administration. And so that also brings up some uncertainty into how to approach the next phase of the U.S.-China relationship. But to your point, we're seeing a bit of a tone downing of the wolf warrior diplomacy. We are seeing some potential more exchanges or releasing of prisoners. And I think that's all positive. My hope is that both sides kind of realize the significance of that and the signals that are being sent out, and so we can kind of move forward to a better relationship, or at least more stability.
Now, I'm noticing as I see the names of people that are going over to China to meet with the Chinese from the administration, and maybe I'm mistaken about this, but I'm noticing that there are more people now that speak Mandarin than there ever were people who go on the other side at that top level to negotiate. I mean, the Chinese have always had speakers who are very proficient in English. Are you noticing this, that there are more people going over negotiating who speak Chinese? Because that could make a huge difference.
It can, and it does. That's true, and it is playing an impact. There was a famous when Jake Sullivan was in Beijing last month. One of the reporters asked him, "Is like, how is it? Do you like having Chinese speakers around you?" And he said, "Yes, it's very helpful." And I think anything we can do to kind of lubricate, the discussion and the communication is effective. One of the things that particularly we're focused on in the education sector is getting more American students into the country.
Yes.
Primarily because we're seeing, at the moment, there's only about 850 students, U.S. students studying in China, and that is just not helpful for a future relationship between the two most powerful countries in the world. And so, to your point, this is something, it's great to have it now, but we're really focused and worried a bit about the next generation, right? Because to be honest, you should be talking to 12 different people who have various points of view on a particular subject, not just a handful. And so this is something that is a big problem that we're focusing on, is how to get more American students in, to really understand the culture, the language, the history. So when they become future leaders, we can actually have more effective discussions.
Well, that is so true. And I just want to end by telling you that 2 weeks from now, I'll be at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where they have a conference that they've had for 75 years, Cameron, where they bring 200 graduate students into West Point and talk about world issues. And I'm going to be co-moderating their table and producing a report on U.S.-China Mideast relations. And it just is so nice to see people at that age getting involved in what you and I are talking about. Hopefully at some point we'll be able to invite Chinese students also into this conference, but of course the politics are not there for it right now. So Cameron Johnson, as we've run out of time, I want to thank you very much for this timely and instructive conversation. You bring a level of information that we don't normally hear on the business side in China. So really, really appreciate it. I hope you will come back, see us again. You'll always be welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you to our viewers from around the world. Please join us again on Polaris-Live.com as we continue to explore the impact of the U.S. presidential elections on the most consequential relationship in the world, that between the United States and China, and its impact on the world. Until then, goodbye.